Well, thanks very much for having us for a start. As was said, I'm Morgan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wolverhampton,
I'm Scott, freelance ecologist.
and we're talking to you today about part of my PhD research. In general, we're looking at bats in an urban area in a conurbation, but this specifically is about monitoring the movements of bats on the Black Country Canal network, and in particular, Dor Benton's bats.
So, I'm sure you all know, lots of bats use waterways and rely on them to get to, or to commute, to forage, to get to swarming sites, all different parts of their life stages, and several species are known to utilise waterways for their commute. Urban matrix, within it, waterways have the highest rates of bat foraging, with soprano pipistrelles and a variety of myotis species being associated with less grey space, so that's your built-up conurbation, and more overhanging emergent vegetation in these wet habitats. Myotis species obviously strongly correlated with steep banks, and that really, in short, makes your urban canal network, which has these steep banks, has this overhanging and emergent vegetation, and is this wet area surrounded by conurbation, it really kind of makes it a hot spot for myotis in urban areas, even more so than the canals, more so than your urban streams and rivers. And obviously, everybody knows good old Dor Bentons, they love a waterway, so we chose to focus on Dor Bentons for this. It's various reasons we chose to focus on Dor Bentons, and we use them as an analogue with this method that we're going to explain for all bat species. But Dor Bentons are very, very predictable in their flight patterns. Using a bat detector and seeing one flying is quite easily to identify which species it is, as Dor Bentons usually flying within 40 centimetres of the water surface, on average 16 to 20 centimetres. The only other bat really that flies consistently that close, within the UK anyway, is the natterers, and they're flying higher up. And obviously you can differentiate between the two using sound analysis. So loads of bats, as we said, soprano pipistrelles use these canal networks, but pipistrelles have highly erratic flight patterns, and things like your liselers and your nocturals, they're flying too high. Whereas Dor Bentons, you can pretty much guarantee the height they're going to be at and the speed they're going to be coming at. So we chose to use Dor Bentons, and we tried to track their movements when they were commuting. And we did that through positioning teams of surveyors at set intervals. The space they were positioned at, Morgan's going to go into a bit more detail on, but depending on the type of survey we were doing, we used two methods. And we combined the acoustic using bat detectors. We used EM-Touch2 Pros with tablets, with visual observations of torches, red LED torches, shining across the canal network. And that allowed us to actually track daubs sequentially as they went through.
So when we were approaching survey design, we modified the existing NBMP waterway survey because that's targeted at Dor Benton's bats. Those surveys start 40 minutes after sunset, but because we know that Dor Bentons have been recorded to emerge up to 14 minutes earlier, especially in the post-parturition period, an hour early recce surveys, they were always out 40 minutes after sunset. We didn't want to miss any, and so we set our survey method to last for an hour, but starting 30 minutes after sunset. So we chose 1 hour because we're only interested in the commuting bats going from their roosts to their nightly foraging areas. And by the end of our survey, the majority of commuting was over by then, and we'd not yet begun to pick up returning bats, which is what we wanted. So as Scott said, we're using red LED torches, and we were coupling that with EM-Touch2 Pro bat detectors, which were granted to us by Wildlife Acoustics. Thank you very much. This would not have been possible without those. And we used visual observations to track the movements, and basically we would use two-way radios. Each team, when a bat passed, would alert the other team of the presence of the bat and the direction it was going. We use red LED torches because we found that when we were trying initially a couple of years ago to set up the survey design, bats were deterred by white light, and so we used red LED torches and we didn't get any deterrent behavior. And we also chose just to survey the evening commute rather than doing dawns or return, just because this timing was, we knew we could get a lot of bats in a certain amount of time, and it was very predictable. So these are the two basic survey designs. We've actually rolled this out over a lot of different type of designs, but these are the two key ones: a linear model which was to identify hop-on and hop-off points where you have, we used 4 teams at 200-metre intervals along stretches of canal, and they would be watching for passing bats and saying, bat, Bravo team, bat north, or Bravo team, bat south, and then that would alert the next team that there was a bat on the way. And with junctions, we positioned our teams just down each of the branches and then with another team in the middle. So, and again, it was sort of Bravo team bat in or bat out when they were going into the junction or out of it. So both of these models rely on predictability of speed, and we're going to talk a bit more about that in a second. Basically, that the speed is variable depending on the curvature of the watercourse, but the known distance between points and then the known mean speed gives us the ability to know an anticipated time of transit from point A to point B. And also predictability of behavior, the bats doing what they're supposed to be doing, flying where they're supposed to be flying. And also it relies on field observations rather than just acoustics.
So on about the predictability of bats again, these are just some from a bunch of studies, the speeds of which bats have been clocked at Dorbentons specifically. So Altrincham had bats flying in excess of 5.5 meters per second. Their foraging flights are around 3.4 meters per second. And they're using their highest speeds when they're commuting. Obviously, they're trying to avoid predators and stuff like that, and they might end up going into exposed areas. We've had 5.6 to 6.4 meters per second commuting in terrestrial habitats. And Neil Middleton got them commuting along canals at 5.3 meters per second. So we timed the bats and saw how fast they were going, and we got them at 6.1 meters per second, which means they're flying about 14 miles per hour in old money. And we did this across various sections of canal that curve and some are straight, so that we know when the bat breaks the torch beam of one, roughly how long it's going to take for it to hit the next torch beam. And that allows for the predictability and allows people to basically not miss bats as often. A bit about the canals in Birmingham and Black Country. So anyone that is a local will proudly tell you that we have more lengths of canal than they do in Venice. We have approximately 100 miles of canal in Birmingham. And it's largely unstudied for bats. It's a very, very urban area. And it's just, a lot of the canals basically just either abandoned and receive not much maintenance, and they're used recreationally for the public for walking and on the canal barges. But what's actually left of this old industry is, as more infrastructure has been built up, as we've had things like the M6 go through, the M6 toll, the canals form these nice little penetrative links between these large infrastructure blockages. They go through conurbation, they go under motorways, in some cases they go over motorways and aqueducts. And they very much link all of our local wildlife sites together, or all our nature reserves, as you can see in the bottom right map. They cut through large areas of conurbation, and a lot of our old nature reserves are abandoned canals and stuff. So they do kind of form this nice blue connective lattice between all of our sites. So running through the basic gist of how these surveys work, here's a stretch of canal that we did to test our survey method. So we had 2.75 kilometers of canal. We split that into 5 sections. Each of those sections had 4 points. So that's 16 survey points in total, 2 visits to each section, 8 surveyors required per visit. We used 8 surveyors because of lone working and stuff with the back group volunteers. We didn't want anyone sitting on the canal in Birmingham by themselves. And then each survey went for about an hour, as Morgan said. So, for example, if we were going to survey from Alpha to Delta, the next survey would be from Delta to Golf, to avoid missing bats moving between Delta and Echo or Charlie and Delta. So there is overlap, and so there's no gaps in the data that we gathered. And this is the kind of data you can get. So grey arrows are linear routes where bats are following the canal. Green arrows are where bats have left the canal, and green arrows are where bats have joined the canal, and red arrows are where bats have left the canal. So we recorded in total 228 bats. We get about 45 passes per survey. In some cases, you get a lot more. You can get as many as 100 passes. So you are collecting a lot of data and a lot of bats. Each one of these arrows has a little number next to it, which gives the percentage of bats either coming on or off of the canal. But in rough, 61% of bats fly all the way from our start point to our end point along this stretch. 30.5% join at some point along the way, And then there is a hop-off point between N and L, this big red arrow, in which basically only 8.3% of the bats using the canal do not leave at this point. So we basically found that all of the bats would fly the full length, and then only about 8.3% of them would have left in total before they got to this point. And then after that point, no bats would pass at the next point. So basically the bats all were leaving to get to a quarry with a massive pool in it. So there's the nice little green corridor the bats were using to leave the canal and get to the quarry and these large water bodies. So we confirmed that basically once you do the survey method and all of a sudden you find that basically at survey point A someone got a bat, survey point B got a bat, then survey point C there isn't the bat anymore, and then it doesn't get to survey point D. The next stage is really to look at the aerial view and look at where could the bats be leaving, and then repeating the survey, but with somebody who has infrared or thermal imaging, and then they can actually see, as you've got in this bottom right composite image, that the bats are jumping off the canal and flying along a linear feature. In this case, it was this little green corridor patch. So as I said earlier, 61% of bats used the full section of canal, and then 93% of those used this hop-off point. So no bats went past this point, and no bats were recorded commuting south on any of the surveys, which is really interesting. All the bats were coming from the south, heading north, but none went back on themselves. So this really, if you look at it in this perspective, bats are travelling from about 2 kilometres away using this canal network to get to this quarry site with the water.
So the junction survey area, we surveyed 7 canal junctions, but these 4 are quite close to each other. So we're using these to sort of like demonstrate what the results look like. So here we've got 4 canal junctions. Again, 16 survey points and 4 points per survey. 3 visits to each section and 8 surveys per visit, 1 hour per survey. As you can see, there's a big pool in the middle, and that's going to be very key in a moment. So the junctions data are very complex to present because I have enough data on every junction to sort of like go into depth for each one. But this is just an overview of, again, with the grey arrows is where the bats are on the canal, the red arrows where the bats are leaving the canal. And as you can see from the west, the north and the south, the bats are all approaching Sheepwash Nature Reserve, which is this collection of pools, as you can see. Nothing comes to the right-hand side. Birmingham City Centre is that way, and a huge section of locks as well. But basically, all of the data here have shown us that there are 2 potential dark corridors where bats are crossing the conurbation to get to where they're going. And then in the middle at the bottom here, this is actually a hop-off point and a crossing point where the bats are crossing both the canal and the live railway. So this survey can sort of like, this method can identify these sites, the potential dark corridor sites where we might want to keep light down, but also identify what might be a really important crossing point for bats where we want to retain tall vegetation to make sure that the bats are not crossing at such a height as they're at risk of direct mortality with the trains.
So we've explained at this point, this is the survey, this is how you do it, but the applications of why others should do it is really the fact that 1, you can inform the selection of dark corridors, places to keep dark, but 2, and what I think is probably the most important, is if you were to just, for example, use static detectors, which we'll go into in a minute, how do you quantify levels of bat activity on that? How do you know that it's not just one bat flying around in a circle? Well, with this, because we get an actual count of the bats using and where the bats are going and where they're jumping off, it can be really useful as like a way of basically informing impact assessments for developments near waterways. In Birmingham, the Black Country, we're having all these nice, luxurious apartments being built, and they're being built along the canal, and the canal towpath's being built upon, and all kinds of lighting pressures. But really, it's like using this, you could do a before and after for consultants, could have this is what we found during the survey, then you do your mitigation, your lighting, and then you get an after effect, this is what we found after, which can really help inform development. Also help identify key foraging grounds. So for example, we now know some very key foraging grounds in our area, main application for it is going to be small and medium scale landscape use data. Obviously, if you're going on the larger landscape use data, you'd want to be doing radio tracking or something. But if you have a small development where you've just got some flats going up or something, this is really like a nice way to get a snapshot snapshot view of the immediate local area and how the bats in the area are using this section of canal or river. It requires minimal equipment. It requires no advanced licensing. You just need basically level 2 licensed person supervising the whole thing. You get data on multiple bats per survey. In some surveys, we've got data on 80 bats. It's standardized, it's repeatable, and it's cost effective because you literally just need you can do it just with a bat detector and a red LED torch and a chair, walkie-talkies and a chair.
So one of the things we wanted to mention was potential limitations to the survey method. So one of the things that does affect the way that, because it has an effect on bats, it has an effect on the efficacy of the survey method, and that is the presence of floating vegetation. What you can see here, these are 2 photos from the same site on the same night. The bottom one is just blanket azolla over the surface of the water. And the Daurbentons do not like this, and they cease to fly at the height that they normally fly at, and it pushes them upwards. And this causes us to rely a little bit more on the acoustic data as the bats are passing by, but also, using the walkie-talkies, you can sort of radio to the other teams, mitigate the effect somewhat by going, oh, these bats are flying high, or they're on the hedgerow or whatever. And then the other thing is light spill. So light spill, this is from a nearby rugby ground that you can see on the same area, and that pushes the bats down. So if the azolla is pushing them up and the lights are pushing them down, they're flying through quite a very narrow corridor along the canal itself. And also, obviously, if there's light spill in the area where you're surveying, bats are harder to see because of your own vision being affected. Other limitations are, you need, if you don't want lone working, you need 8 surveyors to do this survey method. And also, you're limited by the range of your walkie-talkies, especially if your canal is curved, because then they won't work as well.
So thermal and infrared, big talk at the moment, thermal and infrared, and obviously they can enhance your emergent surveys and all sorts of things like that. And they really should be being used on all emergent surveys. They also can enhance this survey method. Thermal is far more appropriate for this because the bats are coming from a distance, and you're going to spot them a lot easier, and it's far less limited, other than the fact that it is obviously currently prohibitively expensive, than infrared, where although it's more affordable, you're limited by your lights and the quality of your camera, and basically to get lights good enough and get a decent professional kit, you have to invest a bit more money. But they will enhance these survey results. You will see bats using them. You'll get a heads up of the bat before it breaks your torchlight. And also you'll be able to see which direction it's heading in when it leaves the canal.
So the results we've presented here, and a lot of other data that we've gathered, are building a compelling case for the importance of canal networks in our urban areas. Then these canals are helping the bats to mitigate other aspects of the conurbation, which would otherwise be a barrier to movement, to foraging, to recruitment from outside areas, and to genetic dispersal. As you can see from the photos here, we have a lot of light pollution problems in our area, and so this is an opportunity for us to sort of gather data and to work with local authorities to make sure that some dark corridors are maintained.
So a question you repeatedly can get asked on this when you're doing this type of thing is, couldn't we just automate the whole thing? Couldn't we just deploy static detectors and get the same results if you put a bunch of statics at set intervals? And initially we thought it's likely you can't, because you can't tell, as I said earlier, if a bat's just flying around in a circle or if it is actually a quantifiable number of bat passes. Also, can you really separate foraging bats from commuting bats? Because Daurbentons on the canal will forage as they commute. They will grab a snack on the way to work, so to speak. So what we did was we placed 4 static bat detectors with various settings, not static, sorry, EM touches with various settings, and we had a look if how they compared to our actual surveyors sat there with a red torch shining across the canal. And then we also tested the accuracy of auto ID to see if the whole thing could be automated and you could just look at the data after it had been through a set process.
So the data set that we use here includes 376 visual observations of Daubenton's bats observed over 8 nights, but these are only represented by 268 recordings, and that's just flat out recordings, not ID'd recordings. So if you look at the left plot, the difference between the count of recorded bats and the actual sample of passes recorded by visual observations is significant. And this underrepresentation is really simple to explain once you've actually gone out and done one of these surveys. The bats fly through in cohorts. So you get 4 bats fly through at once. Your visual observations are like, oh, bravo, bat north, 4 bats. But as far as the detector's concerned, it's only picked up 1. And also the other thing that is very similar is the duration of recording. So we were using 15-second intervals. So if a bat flies by within 15 seconds of the previous bat, then they'll both be on the same recording as well. So that's where the underestimation comes from that point of view. And if you look at the right plot, we also looked at sort of whether it would be possible to rely on auto ID. And while the auto ID provided an accurate species list every time for each survey, the number of passes accurately recorded were, as you can see, as you would expect, if you go to sort of a more accurate setting, then your confidence level is going to be higher, until you're going to have fewer identified recordings. But either way, the take home is that if you weren't using visual observations, you would run the risk of only counting 70% of the bats. And then if you relied on auto ID, you'd run the risk of only accurately identifying 35% of those. So what we found is really a demonstration of the importance of canals in urban areas as a vital resource for bats, a method to cheaply, reliably, repeatedly and easily monitor the movement of bats along waterways without the need for advanced licenses and without the need for expensive equipment and radio tracking. But perhaps most significantly, a reason that fieldcraft might not be dead, and that why we need to reevaluate the merit of well-trained field surveyors. Because recent years have given us huge advantages in technology, and we should be utilising those, and we are, to further conservation efforts and research, but it's not a replacement for surveyors and for boots on the ground. So we're hoping to publish these results shortly, but we genuinely think this method would be really effective if adopted by consultants working to assess impacts near waterways, or even bat groups wanting to work with their local authorities to identify candidate dark corridors.
So we'd like to thank Wildlife Acoustics for supplying the detectors. We'd like to thank Elecon for supplying the software. And we'd like to thank Smidge, who kindly sent us an absolute ton of mozzie repellent, as we were being quite badly savaged, sat on the canal. So if anyone has any questions, we've got some references here, the software we use, the data and hardware. But otherwise, that's it.
Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks, Morgan and Scott. That was really, really great. And I really love, this idea that Birmingham's got more canals than Venice. And, the idea of the lattice was really, really kind of resonated with me.